The Story Girl, Chapter 9, Magic Seeds. When the time came to hand in our collection for the library fund, Peter had the largest, $3. Felicity was a good second with 2.5, and this was simply because the hens had laid so well. If you'd had to pay Father for all the extra handfuls of wheat you've fed those hens, Miss Felicity, you wouldn't have so much, said Dan spitefully. I didn't, retorted Felicity indignantly. Look how Aunt Olivia's hens laid, too, and she fed them herself, just the same as usual. Never mind, said Cecily. We have all got something to give, and if you were like poor Sara Ray and hadn't been able to collect anything, you might feel bad. But Sara Ray had something to give. She came up the hill after tea all radiant. When Sara Ray smiled, and she did not waste her smiles, she was rather pretty in a plaintive, apologetic way. A dimple or two came into sight, and she had very nice teeth, small and white, like the traditional row of pearls. Oh, just look, she said. Here, I have $3, and I'm going to give it all to the library fund. I had a letter today from Uncle Arthur in Winnipeg, and he sent me $3. He said I was to use it any way I liked, so Ma couldn't refuse to let me give it to the fund. She thinks it's an awful waste, but she always goes by what Uncle Arthur says. Oh, I've prayed so hard, and some money might come, and here it is. See what praying does? I'm very much afraid that we did not rejoice quite as unselfishly in Sara Ray's good fortune as we should have done. We had earned our contributions by the sweat of our brow, or by the scarcely less disagreeable method of begging, and Sarah's had as good as descended out of the sky, as much like a miracle as anything you could imagine. She prayed for it, you know, said Felix, after Sara had gone home. That's too easy a way of earning money, grumbled Peter resentfully. If the rest of us had just sat down and done nothing, only prayed, how much do you suppose we'd have? It doesn't seem fair to me. Oh, well, it's different with Sara, said Dan. We could earn money and she couldn't, you see. But come on down to the orchard. The Story Girl had a letter from her father today. She's going to read it to us. We went promptly. A letter from the Story Girl's father was always an event, and to hear her read it was almost as good as hearing her tell a story. Before coming to Carlisle, Uncle Blair Stanley had been a mere name to us. Now he was a personality. His letters to the Story Girl, the pictures, the sketches he sent her, her adoring and frequent mentions of him, all combined to make him very real to us. We felt then, what we did not understand till later years, that our grown-up relatives did not altogether admire or approve of Uncle Blair. He belonged to a different world from theirs. They had never known him very intimately or understood him. I realize now that Uncle Blair was a bit of a bohemian, a respectable sort of tramp. Had he been a poor man, he might have been a more successful artist. But he had a small fortune of his own, and lacking the spur of necessity or the disquieting ambition, he remained little more than a clever amateur. Once in a while he painted a picture, which showed what he could do, but for the rest he was satisfied to wander over the world light-hearted and content. We know that the Story Girl was thought to resemble him strongly in appearance and temperament, but she had far more fire and intensity and strength of will, her inheritance from the king and the ward. She would never be satisfied as a dabbler, whatever her future career should be. Into it she would throw all her powers of mind and heart and soul. Uncle Blair could do at least one thing surpassingly well. He could write letters, such letters. By contrast, Felix and I were secretly ashamed of Father's epistles. Father could talk well, but, as Felix said, he couldn't write worth a cent. The letters we had received from him since his arrival in Rio de Janeiro were mere scrawls, telling us to be good boys and not trouble Aunt Janet, incidentally adding that he was well and lonesome. Felix and I were always glad to get his letters, but we never read them aloud to an admiring circle in the orchard. Uncle Blair was spending the summer in Switzerland, and the letter the Story Girl read to us among the fair, frail white ladies of the walk, where the west wind came now with a sigh and again with a rush, and then brushed our faces as softly as the down of a thistle, was full of the glamour of mountain-rimmed lakes and purple chalets and a snowy summit old in story. We climbed Mount Blanc and saw the Jungfrau soaring into cloudland, and walked among the gloomy pillars of Bonivard prison. Finally, the Story Girl told us the tale of the prisoner of the Chillon in words that were Byron's, but in a voice that was all her own. "It must be just splendid to go to Europe," sighed Cecily longingly. "I'm going some day," the Story Girl said airily. We looked at her with a slightly incredulous awe. To us, in those years, Europe seemed almost as remote and unreachable as the moon. It was hard to believe that one of us should ever go there, but Aunt Julia had gone, and she had been brought up in Carlisle on this very farm, so it was possible that the Story Girl might go too. "What will you do there?" asked Peter practically. "I shall learn how to tell stories to all the world," said the Story Girl dreamily. It was a lovely golden-brown evening. The orchard and the farmlands beyond were full of ruby lights of kissing shadows over the east above the awkward man's house. The wedding veil of the proud princess floated across the sky, presently turning as rosy as if bedewed with her heart's blood. We sat there and talked until the first stars lighted a white taper over the beech hill. When I remembered that I had forgotten to take my dose of magic seed, I hastened to do it, although I was beginning to lose faith in it. I had not grown a single bit, by the merciless testimony of the hall door. I took the box of seed out of my trunk in my room and swallowed the decreed pinch. As I did so, Dan's voice rang out behind me. "Beverly King, what have you got there?" I thrust the box hastily into my trunk and confronted Dan. "None of your business," I said defiantly. "Yes, 'tis." Dan was too much in earnest to resent my blunt speech. "Look here, Bev, is it the magic seed? And did you get it from Billy Robinson?" Dan and I looked at each other, suspicion dawning in our eyes. "What do you know about Billy Robinson and his magic seed?" I demanded. "Just this. I bought a box from him for something, and he said it wasn't going to sell any of it to anybody else. Did he sell it to you?" "Yes, he did," I said in disgust, for I was beginning to understand that Billy and his magic seed were arrant frauds. "What for?" "Your mouth is a decent size," said Dan. "Mouth?" "It had nothing to do with my mouth. He said it would make me grow tall, and it hasn't, not an inch." "I don't see what you wanted it for. You're tall enough." "I got it for my mouth," said Dan with a shamed face. "I got it for my mouth," said Dan with shamefaced grin. "Everybody in school laughs at it so. Kate Mars says it looks like a gash in a pie, and Billy said that the seed would shrink it for sure." Well, there it was. Billy had deceived us both. Nor were we the only victims. We did not find the whole story out at once. Indeed, the summer was almost over before, in one way or another, the full measure of what shameless Billy Robinson iniquity was revealed to us. But I shall anticipate the successive relations in this chapter. Every pupil of Carlisle's school, so it eventually appeared, had bought magic seed, under solemn promise of secrecy. Felix had believed blissfully that it would make him thin. Cecily's hair was to become naturally curly, and Sara Ray was to not be afraid of Peg Bowen any more. It was to make Felicity as clever as the Story Girl, and it was to make the Story Girl a good cook. Skillfully indeed had that astute Billy played on our respective weaknesses. The keenest edge to our humiliation was given by the discovery that the magic seed was nothing more or less than caraway, which grew in abundance at Billy Robinson's uncle's in Markdale. Peg Bowen had had nothing to do with it. Well, we had all been badly hoaxed, but we did not trumpet our wrongs abroad. We did not even call Billy to account. We thought that least said was soonest mended, and in such a matter. We went very softly indeed, lest the grown-ups, especially that terrible Uncle Roger, should hear of it. We should have known better than to trust Billy Robinson, said Felicity, summing up the case one evening when all had been made known. After all, what could you expect from a pig but a grunt? We were not surprised to find that Billy Robinson's contribution to the library fund was the largest handed in by any of the scholars. Cecily said she didn't envy him his conscience, but I am afraid she measured his conscience by her own. I doubt very much if Billy's troubled him at all. Chapter 10. A Daughter of Eve. I hate the thought of growing up, said the Story Girl reflectively, because I can never go barefooted then, and nobody will ever see what beautiful feet I have. We were all in the hayloft, and the Story Girl had been telling us a tale of old unhappy far-off things and battles long ago. Felicity and Cecily were curled up in the corner, and we boys sprawled idly on the fragrant, sun-warm heaps. We had stowed the hay in the loft that morning for Uncle Roger, so we felt that we had earned the right to loll on our sweet-smelling couch. Haylofts are delicious places, with just enough of shadow and soft, uncertain noises to give us an agreeable tang of mystery. Outside of the loft was a vast sunshiny gulf of blue sky, and the mellow air wherein floated fluffy clouds and air tops of maple and spruce. Pat was with us, of course, prowling about stealthily or making frantic, bootless leaps at the swallows. A cat in a hayloft is a beautiful example of the eternal fitness of things. We had not heard of this fitness then, but we all felt that Paddy was in his own place in a hayloft. I think it is very vain to talk about anything you have yourself being beautiful, remarked Felicity. I'm not a bit vain, said the Story Girl with an entire trustfulness. It is not vanity to know your own good points. It would just be stupidity if you didn't. It's only vanity when you get puffed up about them. I am not a bit pretty. My only good points are my hair, my eyes and feet. So I think it's real mean that one of them has to be covered up the most of the time. I'm always glad when it gets warm enough to go barefooted. But when I grow up, they'll have to be covered all the time. It is mean. You'll have to put your shoes and stockings on when you go to the magic lantern show tonight, said Felicity in a tone of satisfaction. I don't know that. I'm thinking of going barefooted. Oh, you wouldn't, Sarah Stanley. You're not in earnest, exclaimed Felicity, her blue eyes filling with horror. The Story Girl winked aside at her face next to Felix and me, but the side next to the girls changed not a muscle. She dearly loved to take a rise out of Felicity now and then. Indeed, I would if I just made up my mind to. Why not? Why not barefoot? If they're clean, as well as bare hands and face. Oh, you wouldn't. It would be such a disgrace, and poor Felicity said this in real distress. We went to school barefooted all June, argued the wicked Story Girl. What is the difference between going to a schoolhouse barefooted in the daytime and going in the evening? Oh, there's every difference. I can't just explain it, but everyone knows there is a difference. You know it yourself. Oh, please, don't do such a thing, Sarah. Well, I won't, just to oblige you, said the Story Girl, who would have died to death before she would have gone in public meeting barefooted. We were all rather excited over the magic lantern show, which a lecturer was to give in the schoolhouse that evening. Even Felix and I, who had seen such shows galore, were interested, and the rest were quite wild. There had never been such a thing in Carlisle before. We were all going, Peter included. Peter went everywhere with us now. He was a regular attendant at school and church, where his behavior was as irreproachable as if he had ever been raised in the castle of Vere. It was a feather in the Story Girl's cap, for she took all the credit of having started Peter on the right road. Felicity was resigned, although the fatal patch on Peter's best trousers was still an eyesore to her. She declared she never got any good of the singing, because Peter stood up then and everyone could see the patch. Mrs. James Clark, whose pew was behind us, never took her eyes off it, or so Felicity said. But Peter's stockings were always darned. Aunt Olivia had seen to that, ever since she heard of Peter's singular device regarding them on his first Sunday. She had also given Peter a Bible, of which he was most proud, and he hated to use it lest it should soil it. "I think I'll wrap it up and keep it in my box," he said. "I've an old Bible of Aunt Jane's at home. I can use that. I suppose it's just the same, even if it is old, isn't it?" "Oh, yes," said Cecily. "The Bible is always the same. I thought maybe they'd got some new improvements on it since Aunt Jane's day," said Peter, relieved. "Sara Ray is coming along the lane, and she's crying," announced Dan, who was peering out of the knothole on the opposite side of the loft. "Sara Ray is crying half her time," said Cecily impatiently. "I'm sure she cries a quart-full of tears in a month. There are times when you can't help crying, but I hide them. Sara just goes and cries in public." Sara presently joined us, and we discovered the cause of her tears to be the doleful fact that her mother had forbidden her to go to the magic lantern show that night. We all showed the sympathy we felt. "She said yesterday you could go," said the Story Girl indignantly. "Why has she changed her mind?" "Because of measles in Markdale," sobbed Sara. "She says Markdale is full of them, and there'll be sure to be some of Markdale people at the show. So I'm not to go, and I've never seen a magic lantern. I've never seen anything." "I don't believe there's any danger of catching measles," said Felicity. "If there were, we wouldn't be allowed to go." "I wish I could get the measles," said Sara defiantly. "Maybe I'd be of some importance to Ma then." "Suppose Cecily goes down with you and coaxes your mother," suggested the Story Girl. "Perhaps she'd let you go." "She likes Cecily. She doesn't like either Felicity or me, so it would only make matters worse for us to go." "Ma's gone to town. Pa and her went this afternoon, and they're not coming back till tomorrow. There's nobody home but Judy Pineau and me." "Then," said the Story Girl, "why don't you just go to the show anyhow? Your mother won't even know if you coax Judy to hold her tongue." "Oh, but that's wrong," said Felicity. "You shouldn't put Sara up to disobeying her mother." Now Felicity, for once, was undoubtedly right. The Story Girl's suggestion was wrong, and if it had been Cecily who protested, the Story Girl would probably have listened to her and proceeded no further in the matter. But Felicity was one of those unfortunate people who protests against wrongdoing serves only to drive the wrongdoer further on into her sinful ways. The Story Girl resented Felicity's superior tone and proceeded to tempt Sara in right good earnest. The rest of us held our tongues. It was, we told ourselves, Sara's own lookout. "I have a good mind to do it," said Sara, "but I can't get my good clothes. They're in the spare room, and Ma locked the door, for fear somebody would get at the fruit cake. I haven't a single thing to wear, except my school gingham." "Well, that's new and pretty," said the Story Girl. "We'll lend you some things. You can have my lace collar. That'll make the gingham quite elegant. And Cecily will lend you her second-best hat." "But I have no shoes or stockings. They're locked up too." "You can have a pair of mine," said Felicity, who probably thought that since Sara was certain to yield to temptation, she might as well be garbed decently for her transgression. Sara did yield. When the Story Girl's voice entreated, it was not easy to resist its temptation, even if you wanted to. That evening, when we started for the schoolhouse, Sara Ray was among us, decked out in borrowed plumes. "Suppose she does catch the measles," Felicity said. "I don't believe there'll be anybody there from Markdale. The lecturer is going to Markdale next week." "They'll wait for that," said the Story Girl airily. It was a cool, dewy evening, and we walked down the long, red hill in the height of spirits. Over a valley filled with beech and spruce was a sunset afterglow, creamy yellow in a hue that was not so much red as the dream of a red, with a young moon swung low in it. The air was sweet with breath of mellow hay fields, where swaths of clover had been steeped in the sun. Wild roses grew pinkly along the fences, and the roadsides were star-dusted with buttercups. Those of us who had nothing the matter with our conscience enjoyed our walk to the little whitewashed schoolhouse in the valley. Felicity and Cecily were void of offenses towards all men, and the Story Girl walked uprightly like an incarnate flame in her crimson silk. Her pretty feet were hidden in the tan-colored, buttoned Paris boots, which were the secret envy of every schoolgirl in Carlisle. But Sara Ray was not happy. Her face was so melancholic that the Story Girl lost patience with her. The Story Girl herself was not altogether at ease. Probably her own conscience was troubling her, but admit it she would not. "Now, Sara," she said, "you just take my advice and go into this with all your heart, if you go at all. Never mind if this is bad. There's no use in being naughty if you spoil your fun by wishing all the time that you were good. You can repent afterwards, but there's no use in mixing the two things together." "I'm not repenting," protested Sara. "I'm only scared of Ma finding it out." "Oh," said the Story Girl. Her voice expressed her scorn. For remorse she had understanding and sympathy, but fear of her fellow creatures was something unknown to her. "Didn't Judy Pineau promise you solemnly she wouldn't tell?" "Yes, but maybe somebody who sees me there will mention it to Ma and—" "Well, if you are so scared, you'd better not go. It isn't too late. Here's your own gate," said Cecily. But Sara could not give up the delights of the show. So she walked on, a small, miserable testimony that the way of transgressors is never easy, even when said transgressor is only a damsel of 11. The magic lantern show was a splendid one. The views were good and the lecturer witty. We repeated his jokes to each other all the way home. Sara, who had not enjoyed the exhibition at all, seemed to feel more cheerful when it was all over and she was going home. The Story Girl, on the contrary, was gloomy. "There were Markdale people there," she confided to me, "and the Williamsons live next door to the Cowans, who have the measles. I wish I'd never egged Sara on to go. But don't tell Felicity I said so. If Sara Ray had really enjoyed the show, I wouldn't mind, but she didn't. I could see that. So I've done wrong and made her do wrong, and there's nothing to show for it." Chapter 11. The Story Girl Does Penance. 10 days later, Aunt Olivia and Uncle Roger went to town one evening to remain overnight, and the next day Peter and the Story Girl were to stay at Uncle Alec's during their absence. We were in the orchard at sunset, listening to the Story Girl tell the story of King Cophetua and the beggar maid, all of us except Peter, who was hoeing turnips, and Felicity, who had gone down the hill on an errand for Mrs. Ray. The Story Girl impersonated the beggar maid so vividly and with such an illusion of beauty, and we did not wonder in the least at the king's love for her. I had read the story before, and it had been my opinion that it was rot. No king, I felt certain, would ever marry a beggar maid when he had princesses galore from whom to choose. But now I understood it all. When Felicity returned, we concluded from her expression that she had news. And she had. "Sara is real sick," she said with regret, and something that was not regret mingled in her voice. "She has a cold and a sore throat, and she's feverish. Mrs. Ray says if she isn't better by the morning she's going to send for the doctor, and she's afraid it might be measles." Felicity flung the last sentence at the Story Girl, who turned very pale. "Oh, do you suppose she caught them at the magic lantern show?" she said miserably. "Where else could she have caught them?" said Felicity mercilessly. "I didn't see her, of course. Mrs. Ray met me at the door and told me not to come in. But Mrs. Ray says the measles always goes awful hard with the Rays. If you don't die completely of them, it leaves them deaf or half blind or something like that. Of course," added Felicity, her heart melting at the sight of the misery of the Story Girl's piteous eyes, "Mrs. Ray always looks on the dark side, and it may not be the measles Sara has after all." But Felicity had done her work too thoroughly. The Story Girl was not to be comforted. "I'd give anything if I'd never put Sara up to going to the show," she said. "It's all my fault, but the punishment falls on Sara. That isn't fair. I'd go this minute and confess the whole thing to Mrs. Ray, but if I did, it might get Sara into more trouble, and I mustn't do that. I shan't sleep a wink tonight." I don't think she did. She looked very pale and woebegone when she came down to breakfast, but for all that, there was a certain exhilaration about her. "I'm going to do penance all day for coaxing Sara to disobey her mother," she announced with chastened triumph. "Penance?" we murmured in bewilderment. "Yes, I'm going to deny myself everything I like, and do everything I can think of that I don't like, just to punish myself for being so wicked. And if any of you think of anything I don't, just mention it to me. I thought it out last night. Maybe Sara won't be so very sick if God sees I'm truly sorry." "He can see it anyhow, without your doing anything," said Cecily. "Well, my conscience will feel better." "I don't believe Presbyterians ever do penance," said Felicity doubtfully. "I never heard of one doing it." But the rest of us rather looked with favor on the Story Girl's idea. We felt sure that she would do penance as picturesquely and thoroughly as she did everything else. "You might put peas in your shoes, you know," suggested Peter. "The very thing. I never thought of that. I'll get some after breakfast. I'm not going to eat a single thing all day except bread and water, and not much of that." This, we felt, was a heroic measure indeed, to sit down to one of Aunt Janet's meals in ordinary health and appetite, and eat nothing but bread and water. And that would be penance with a vengeance. We felt we could never do it, but the Story Girl did it. We admired and pitied her. But now I do not think that she either needed our pity or deserved our admiration. Her ascetic fare was really sweeter to her than honey. She was, though quite unconsciously, acting a part, and tasting all the subtle joy of the artist, which is so much more exquisite than any material pleasure. Aunt Janet, of course, noticed the Story Girl's abstinence, and asked if she was sick. "No, I'm just doing penance, Aunt Janet, for a sin I committed. I can't confess it, because that would bring trouble on another person, so I'm going to do penance all day. You don't mind, do you?" Aunt Janet was in very good humor that morning, so she merely laughed. "Not if you don't go too far with your nonsense," she said tolerantly. "Thank you. And will you give me a handful of hard peas after breakfast, Aunt Janet? I want to put them in my shoes." "There isn't any. I used the last in the soup yesterday." "Oh!" The Story Girl was much disappointed. "Then I suppose I'll have to do without. The new peas wouldn't hurt enough. They're much too soft, and would just go squash flat." "I'll tell you," said Peter. "I'll pick up a lot of those little round pebbles on Mr. King's front walk. They'll be just as good as peas." "You'll do nothing of the sort," said Aunt Janet. "Sara must not do penance in that way. She would wear holes in her stockings and might seriously bruise her feet." "What would you say if I took a stick and whipped myself?" "I wouldn't say anything," retorted Aunt Janet. "I'd simply turn you over my knee and give you a sound, solid spanking, Miss Sara. You'd find that penance enough." The Story Girl was crimson with indignation. To have such a remark made to you when you were 14 and a half, and before boys too, really, Aunt Janet could be very dreadful. It was vacation, and there was not much to do that day. We were soon free to seek the orchard, but the Story Girl would not come. She had seated herself in the darkest, hottest corner of the kitchen with a piece of old cotton in her hand. "I'm not going out to play today," she said, "and I'm not going to tell a single story. Aunt Janet won't let me put pebbles in my shoes, but I'm put a thistle next to my skin on my back, and it sticks into me if I lean back the least bit, and I'm going to work buttonholes all over this cotton. I hate working buttonholes worse than anything in the world, so I'm going to work them all day." "What's the good of working buttonholes on an old rag?" asked Felicity. "It isn't any good. The beauty of penance is that it makes you feel uncomfortable, so it doesn't matter what you do, whether it's useful or not, so long as it's nasty. Oh, I wonder how Sara is this morning." "Mother's going down this afternoon," said Felicity. "She says none of us must go near the place till we know whether it is measles or not." "I've thought of a great penance," said Cecily eagerly. "Don't go to the missionary meeting tonight." The Story Girl looked piteous. "I thought of that myself, but I can't stay home, Cecily. It would be more than flesh and blood could endure. I must hear the missionary speak. They say he has all but been eaten by cannibals. Just think how many new stories I'd have to tell after that. No, I must go, but I'll tell you what. I'll wear my school dress and hat. That will be my penance. Felicity, when you set the table for dinner, put the broken-handled knife for me. I hate it so, and I'm going to take a dose of Mexican tea every 2 hours. It's such a dreadful tasting stuff, but it's good blood purifier, so Aunt Janet can't object to it." The Story Girl carried out her self-imposed penance fully. All day she sat in the kitchen and worked buttonholes, and subsisting on bread and water and Mexican tea. Felicity did a mean thing. She went to work and made little raisin pies right there in the kitchen before the Story Girl. The smell of raisin pies is something to tempt an anchorite, and the Story Girl was exceedingly fond of them. Felicity ate 2 in her very presence, and then brought the rest of us out in the orchard some more. The Story Girl could see us through the window, carousing without stint on raisin pies and Uncle Edward's cherries. But she worked on her buttonholes. She would not look at the exciting serial in the new magazine Dan brought home from the post office. Neither would she open a letter from her father. Pat came over, but his most seductive purrs won no notice from his mistress, who refused herself the pleasure of even patting him. Aunt Janet could not go down the hill in the afternoon to find out how Sara Ray was because company came to tea. The Millwards from Markdale. Mr. Millward was a doctor, and Mrs. Millward was a B.A. Aunt Janet was very desirous that everything should be as nice as possible, and we were all sent to our rooms before tea to wash up and dress. The Story Girl slipped over home, and when she came back we gasped. She had combed her hair out straight and braided it in a tight, kinky, pudgy braid, and she wore an old dress of faded print with holes in the elbows and ragged flounces, which was much too short for her. "Sara Stanley, have you taken leave of your senses?" demanded Aunt Janet. "What do you mean by putting on such a rig? Don't you know I have company to tea?" "Yes, and that's just why I put it on, Aunt Janet. I want to mortify the flesh." I'll mortify you if I catch you showing yourself to the Millwards like that, my girl. Go right home and dress yourself decently, or eat your supper in the kitchen." The Story Girl chose the latter alternative. She was highly indignant. I verily believe that to sit at the dining-room table in that shabby, outgrown dress, conscious of looking her ugliest, and eating only bread and water before the critical Millwards, would have been positive bliss to her. When we went to the missionary meeting that evening, the Story Girl wore her school dress and hat, and while Felicity and Cecily were in their pretty muslins, and she had tied her hair with a snuff brown ribbon, which was very unbecoming to her. The first person we saw on the church porch was Mrs. Ray. She told us that Sara had nothing worse than a feverish cold. The missionary had at least 7 happy listeners that night. We were all glad that Sara did not have measles, and the Story Girl was radiant. "Now you see all your penance was wasted," said Felicity, as we walked home, keeping close together, because of a rumor that Peg Bowen was abroad. "Oh, I don't know. I feel better since I punished myself. But I'm going to make up for it tomorrow," said the Story Girl energetically. "In fact, I'll begin tonight. I'm going to the pantry as soon as I get home, and I'll read Father's letter before I go to bed. Wasn't the missionary splendid? The cannibal story was simply grand. I tried to remember every word so that I can tell it just as he did. Missionaries are such noble people." "I'd like to be a missionary and have adventures like that," said Felix. "It would be all right, if you could be sure that the cannibals would be interrupted in the nick of time, as his were," said Dan. "But supposing they weren't?" "Nothing would prevent cannibals from eating Felix if they once caught him," giggled Felicity. "He's so fat." I'm sure Felix felt very unlike a missionary at that precise moment. "I'm going to put 2 cents more a week in my missionary box than I have been doing," said Cecily. 2 cents more a week out of Cecily's egg money meant something of a sacrifice. It inspired the rest of us. We all decided to increase our weekly contributions by a cent or so, and Peter, who had no missionary box at all up to this time, determined to start one. "I don't seem to be able to feel as interested in missionaries as you folks do," he said, "but maybe if I begin to give something, I'll get interested. I'll want to know how my money's being spent. I won't be able to give much. When your father runs away and your mother goes on washing, and you're only old enough to get 50 cents a week, you can't give much. But I'll do the best I can. My Aunt Jane was fond of missions. Are there any Methodist heathens? I suppose I ought to give my box to them, rather than the Presbyterian heathens." "No, it's only after they're converted that they're anything in particular," said Felicity. "Before that, they're just plain heathen. But if you want your money to go to a Methodist missionary, you can give it to the Methodist minister in Markdale. I guess the Presbyterians can get along without it, and look after their own heathens." "Just smell Mrs. Simpson's flowers," said Cecily, as we passed a trim white paling close to the road, over which blew odors sweeter than the perfume of Araby's shores. "Her roses are all out, and that bed of Sweet Williams is a sight by daylight." "Sweet Williams is a dreadful name for a flower," said the Story Girl. "Williams is a man's name, and men are never sweet. They are a great many nice things, but they are not sweet, and shouldn't be. That is, for a woman. Oh, look at the moonshine on the road in that gap between the spruces. I'd like a dress of moonshine with stars for buttons."